He's hoping to have a real confrontation, which might allow him to declare a national emergency and then rule truly as an autocrat.
Really?
People talk about, well, the 2026 midterm elections. I'm not sure we're going to have them.
In 50 years' time, will America still be a democracy, yes or no?
I don't know.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Fourcast from here in Washington, D.C. as President Trump reaches the first 100 days of his second term. And what a wild 3 months it's been. Donald Trump upending global economics, questioning America's relationship with its allies, smashing its system of governance, and all with the scratch of a Sharpie pen. But is Trump's behaviour an aberration or just the latest manifestation of a nation sliding towards illiberalism? Well, one man who's thought about this question a lot, whether Trump is an aberration or part of a pattern, is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Steven Hahn, whose book is called Illiberal America, A History. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
This is really the key question that we're all trying to answer after 3 turbulent months. Is Trump an aberration or is he part of a pattern?
It would be very hard to find an example of a president of the United States before Trump who behaved in this way, had the ambitions and policies that he has. But I would say that in many ways, if you look at the state and local levels, if you look at people who serve in Congress and their own sensibilities, there is a long history of what I call illiberalism, which is not just one thing, it's a variety of ideas and sensibilities and relationships that have changed over time, but kind of feed off a set of perspectives on the world.
We all love looking at American history, and when we do, we tend to look at great figures like, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and, of course, George Washington. One president that rarely crops up in conversation in Europe is a guy called Andrew Jackson. But Andrew Jackson is someone that Trump, even in his first term, admired greatly. And I'm assuming that his portrait is hanging up in the newly readorned and golden-leafed old Oval Office. Tell us about Andrew Jackson, why he might be so important to Donald Trump.
Right. Well, Andrew Jackson is a symbol of a powerful leader. He has been identified as a sort of symbol of the common man, so to speak, of democratization in American life and politics. But it's also important to recognize that the 1830s in particular was a time of mass expulsions that he was in part responsible for. Most vividly and horrifically was the expulsion of thousands of native people from their homelands east of the Mississippi to a vague place called Indian Territory out in the Trans-Mississippi West. But it was a time when Catholics and Black people and Mormons and Masons were being expelled from various areas of American life. So it's a way of recognizing, as Abraham Lincoln at the time and even Tocqueville in Democracy America recognized, that, American democracy and illiberal expulsions are interconnected. They're not separate or parallel tracks. And so that to that extent, you could make, I think, a very strong argument that what emerges in the 1820s and 1830s in the Jacksonian period is what you could call really an illiberal democracy.
And of course, Andrew Jackson famously had a fight with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, I believe it ruled against him, and he more or less said, bring it on. What are you going to do about it?
That's right. One of the decisions in particular was not to Jackson's liking, and he said, okay, let him enforce it. And in a sense, the resonance today is a reminder that, the rule of law in the United States depends on respecting the findings of courts of law. The courts themselves do not have direct enforcement power. So it's really, in a sense, the courts and the legislature come up with policies, but it's in the executive branch to really enforce them. And if the executive refuses to do so and Congress just goes along with it, there's really nothing the courts could do unless people, get sufficiently upset about it so that it has true political consequences. But I think that one of the reasons he really admires Jackson is not only because he was, a strong leader, but also because he decided he would go his own way, regardless of what the courts and other institutions decided. So
Mm,
Donald Trump is hardly the
mm,
first person to try to wield or expand the power of the executive branch. And certainly
mm,
until Trump, people in the Republican Party and on the right in general were very critical of the concentration of power in the federal government and, seemed to be vocal supporters of what is called state rights or local control.
mm,
Now it seems
mm,
to flip so that they're very strong supporters of Donald Trump's amassing in
mm,
many ways
mm.
unprecedented power. He's testing the limits of what
Sure.
might be acceptable. And I think he's a provocateur because he's hoping to have a real confrontation, which might allow
Mm.
him to declare a national emergency and then rule, truly as a autocrat.
Do you really think that that's what he wants to do? Is that part of his plan?
I think it is part of his plan. I think that especially if he sees opposition mounting, I do believe. I mean, look, he's provoking a confrontation with the courts. It's unclear what the Supreme Court will say on the issue of birthright citizenship. I don't know what the vote will be on the court, but it's hard for me to believe that there will be a majority to support his view that birthright citizenship itself can be undermined. I think that's one of the
Mm.
provocations, and I do fear. I mean, I'm a historian, have enough trouble of trying to figure out what happened in the past, let alone to predict what's going to happen in the future. My fear is that uh, if political mobilizations against him grow, and he feels that through a democratic process or through protected rights and the ways of expressing grievances, First Amendment rights, and so on, threaten his power. I fear he will declare a national emergency. People talk about, well, the 2026 midterm elections. I'm not sure we're going to have them.
Really?
I'm not sure we won't have them, but I do feel that in the event, even beforehand, but in the event that it appears that the Republicans may lose control of Congress, I think he will look for an opportunity. Look, he was thinking about that in relationship to the 2020 election. And, he didn't do it. I think part of his effort to surround himself with hardcore loyalists, especially in the
Mm.
military, which is under his, at least in theory, his direct command. And at one point in his first term, when he wanted to get the U.S. military involved in activities that really wasn't appropriate for them, he had pushback. He won't have that anymore. So again, so far protests have been relatively localized and not of the scale yet that I think he may find
Mm.
threatening. But again, I'm expressing my fear because I don't think he would
Mm.
think twice
Sure.
about declaring a national emergency and whether that means, effectively suspending Congress or arrogating even greater powers to himself and effectively declaring martial law. That I don't think that's out of the
That's,
question at all.
but I mean, Trump people would say, if Trump takes these emergency measures, that's what Roosevelt was thinking about. That's what other presidents have done under different circumstances. So why be so hard on me if I'm just using these, albeit rather extreme constitutional measures to unify the country or prevent it from falling apart?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there are earlier examples of executives moving to enlarge their power well beyond what was precedent. Now, remember too, Richard Nixon, had his enemies list. He tried to,
Mm.
involve the FBI and the CIA and the IRS to punish them. He was particularly suspicious of the press. He definitely was very hostile to African Americans and to Jews. So this kind of behavior by a president of the United States is not unprecedented. I think the extent to
Mm.
which Trump is attempting to use powers that he regards as legitimate to move even so forcefully against his enemies, so forcefully against those he regards as invading the country and effectively declaring war on them. I don't think it's an argument that it has or is going to stand up in the courts. I mean, the courts have pushed it back
Mm.
in his face, virtually across the board. But they haven't ordered him, except in
Mm.
couple of cases, to desist. And so he's just going to go on and ignore them.
I wonder if there are two underlying problems here. One is that we, this country, but also the rest of the world, has fetishized the American president, but also we fetishized America's exceptionalism. And there is a sort of feeling until recently that America could never be anything other than a democracy. Is that the trap that we've fallen into?
I think for people, white people from the middle class on up, they've had the luxury of imagining that we have long had a liberal democracy because their rights have not been really trampled on. But if you're of
Mm.
African descent, if you're of native descent, if you are from any one of a number of immigrant groups, and or if you are white and in the working class, your view of this is very, very different. And so we may
Mm.
tout, I mean, one of the things that really interested me in writing this book was not Trump per se, but when he came on the scene in 2015, 16, and observers and journalists kept saying how he was violating liberal democratic norms, as if, everything was going on very well beforehand. I mean, in the 20 years beforehand, the Supreme Court had decided a presidential election. The Supreme Court had opened the spigots of big money or undermined the Voting Rights Act. This is before the Dobbs decision. The Republican Party was moving to the right. David Duke ran for
Mm.
governor and Senate in Louisiana and won nearly 60% of the white vote, even though they knew he was a Nazi and a Klansman. So you gotta, in some ways, the period where we had anything close to a liberal democracy was between 1965 and the 1990s, 65 being when the Voting Rights Act
Mm.
was signed into law and therefore undermining the disfranchisement of millions
Mm.
of black voters. So I guess part of what
Mm.
my book is an attempt to do is to say, look, we have to think hard about, our own
Yeah.
history and the ways in which some of its political currents have been very, very damaging.
Do you think that Trump is the most illiberal president the United States has ever had?
Well, in some ways, no, because remember, um, Jim Crow was the law of the land. It was enforced. Think about Woodrow Wilson. He was the first Southerner who was elected president since the Civil War. He oversaw the segregation of the federal bureaucracy. He supported the idea of black inferiority. Um, and he too sort of bought in to a kind of imperial sense of the United States. I mean, Trump is in some ways the most illiberal because of his marking even more internal enemies who need to be excluded or expelled or repressed in other ways. But under Wilson's presidency, the federal government rounded up, in some cases deported, in other cases incarcerated political radicals. I mean, Eugene Debs ran for president from a jail cell. So I don't, again, I think that, illiberal policies and the acceptance of, the disadvantaging of important sections of the population, violating their rights, discriminating against them, is a long story in American history. It's
Yeah.
more unusual to find presidents who move in other directions.
So if you're a depressed liberal hiding behind the sofa with your head in your hands and you're worried about the future of the republic, where does the hope come from?
I think we have to recognize that in many ways liberalism has exhausted itself. And so what we need to do is revitalize, the best, highest ambition that liberalism gave us while recognizing that we need to go way beyond it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it seems to me that those who are very worried about what's going on, I think about a sort of two-aspect response. One is short term, which is we need to resist day after day. We need to protest. We need to protect people who are vulnerable and who are going to be subject to repression and punishment for which it's difficult for them to defend against. I think we need to find each other. Think we need to work in whatever way we can on a small way. And over time, I think we need to recognize that it's not the economy, stupid. It's the political culture that the right has basically taken control of for decades. And, we need to remember that in the 1930s and 40s and into the 60s, there was a different political culture. There was an idea of a more activist, more progressive federal government, expanding rights, rethinking democracy in ways that move beyond simply the political. And I think we need to try to recapture and expand that kind of political culture. And that is not going to happen tomorrow.
In 50 years' time, will America still be a democracy? Yes or no?
I don't know. I mean, I know that's not the answer you want to hear. I don't. I am deeply worried. Um, I I do believe in change. I was attracted to studying history because I was moved over time by ordinary people or people who were at the margins who took matters into their own hands and were able to change the course of history, not always the way they wanted it, not always fully, but in very, very moving ways. But I don't know.
Steve Hahn, a historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, author of Illiberal America, A History. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition from Washington, D.C. of the Fourcast. Goodbye.